Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing Game 6 of the regular season between the San Jose Sharks and the Nashville Predators, in which the Sharks have lost 3-1 as they move to 4-2 on the season, and they conclude this early season 5-game road trip that they started right after their first game of the year against the Winnipeg Jets with a record of 3-2. And honestly, if you had told me coming into this season, if I was looking at the schedule and I saw this early 5-game road trip and you told me the Sharks were going to go 3-2, get a total of 6 of a possible 10 points on that road trip, I honestly would have been pretty happy with that. So even though this seems kind of sad that the Sharks started off the road trip on fire 3-0 but then lost the last two, in the grand scheme of things, the Sharks actually find themselves in a pretty decent position. And when it comes to this game in particular, I thought actually the analyst for this game put it best. It was Cassie Campbell-Pascal, exclusively on ESPN+, who put it best when she said that the Sharks didn't necessarily look physically tired in this game, as I thought their speed wasn't necessarily an issue in this one, but it was that the Sharks looked mentally tired in this one at the end of this 5-game road trip with a lot of games played in a pretty condensed period of time. This was probably the worst game of the season in terms of puck management for the San Jose Sharks, as it was just defensive zone turnover after defensive zone turnover, neutral zone turnover after neutral zone turnover, and just not realistically able to connect a lot of passes with each other. I thought the defense in particular had some really suspect plays on the backside in their own zone. And so while this wasn't necessarily a clinic here by the Nashville Predators, they weren't necessarily just firing shot after shot after shot, completely dominating the San Jose Sharks. This was a very winnable game against a not fantastic Nashville Predators team, though a pretty good Predators team, that the Sharks just didn't seem prepared for, I guess you could say. And it started off very early on in this game, like it did in the previous one against the Boston Bruins. The Nashville Predators scored just 80 seconds into this one on an early power play for themselves. Matt Duchene put it past James Reimer to make it 1-0, and that would be the only goal scoring in that first period. The Sharks were not the better team for the first half of that first period, but would get 2 power plays late in that period. And while they worked the puck around the zone a good amount, and they actually had some decent chances with a bit of bad luck with some broken sticks, they were unable to actually score, and it was a 1-0 Predators lead after 20 minutes. In the second period, it didn't really get that much better for the San Jose Sharks, and the Predators would again be the only team to actually score a goal in the period, getting one from Philip Forsberg, and it was then 2-0 after 40 minutes for Nashville. Moving into the third period, it was again very reminiscent of the previous game against the Boston Bruins. The Sharks didn't necessarily start off this period particularly well, but eventually just seemed to flip a switch around halfway through the third period and would start to get some good opportunities for themselves. And it would start with a Timo Meier goal to get to within 1 goal in this game. Timo Meier has just been on fire, and he adds another goal to his total on the year. And the Sharks came so close to tying this game just a couple minutes later, again with this first line on the ice. Jonathan Dahlen got it past UC Saros after digging the puck out of a sea of bodies in front of the Nashville Predators goaltender, but unfortunately could not beat the stick of Nashville Predators centerman Ryan Johansson, who was very aware in the Predators crease to be able to keep this puck out of the net. And eventually the Sharks just ended up losing this one. The Predators also would add an empty netter from Mikael Granlund, who would kind of just wildly spin and fire this puck from in front of his goaltender, and it seemed as though the spirit of like Pekka Rinne, still living in Bridgestone Arena, seemed to carry this puck into the empty net, because it seemed to be veering more to the right but then somehow veered back to the left and ended up going in. So a bit of an unfortunate break there for the San Jose Sharks, but in the end they fell behind in this game, and it was just too little too late of a comeback effort. If we saw this switch flipped, halfway through the second period, the Sharks would have had ample opportunity to try and come back in this game, but the fact that they do it with just a few minutes left in the third period makes it very difficult to actually come back against a very solid defensive team with a very solid goaltender like the Nashville Predators. Moving on to the Sharks lineup, once again, it was the first line leading the way. Obviously, you take a look at this and you say, well, can the Sharks actually have a game in which more than just one line actually shows up to play? Yeah, that's not a great thing, but at the very least, it's better than last last season when the Sharks had pretty much 4 somewhat dysfunctional lines. So this season, having one that you can consistently expect to show up game in and game out is actually a nice change of pace. And Couture, Meier, and Dahlin have just been outstanding. Obviously, a bit of a slow start to the game for themselves, but even in second period, even in the first period, this was still the best line for the San Jose Sharks, even if it wasn't, amazing and standing out so well. But clearly, Meier finally showing up to be that player that the Sharks thought they were getting when they signed him to that deal that so many people thought was an absolute steal. I remember last season people were thinking, this Timo Meier contract is really bad for the San Jose Sharks. But remember just a couple of years ago when he actually signed it after that 18-19 season breakout year for himself, people were saying this was going to be a massive steal, the steal of the offseason in terms of contracts. And Meier finally showing that was the case with this performance thus far this season. And when it comes to Jonathan Dahlin, he's just been such a fantastic, solid player on this first line, just has fit in seamlessly with Meier and Logan Couture. It seems as though these players have had the chemistry of playing together for years, even though they've only been playing together for now 6 games this season. So very impressive. When it comes down to the second line, there were more lineup substitutions made this game. Eklund drew back into the lineup, though not in place of Barabanov, technically in his positioning in the lineup on the second line with Hertl. However, it was actually Gadjevich who steps out of the lineup. Barabanov moved on to the fourth line in Gadjevich's position, and so Eklund comes onto the second line. Kind of an awkward choice, I would say, especially since Gadjevich looked pretty good last game, but it is what it is. And joining Eklund and Hertl on the second line was actually Kevin Labanc, getting a boost from that third line onto the second line back into these top 6 here with these players, because he actually had a pretty decent start to the season thus far. I actually do want to talk about Eklund. I've obviously been pretty hard on Eklund thus far throughout his very, very, very short career with the San Jose Sharks, especially since a lot of other people, that you might listen to talk about the San Jose Sharks, they've all been very, very high on Eklund and what he can bring to this team. I myself have not been as much, but here tonight, I will give credit where credit is due. Eklund, this was definitely his best game as a San Jose Shark, at least in the regular season thus far. He looked much more on top of things, which actually makes it somewhat disappointing that Bob Booner didn't necessarily reward him so much for that. Actually, on the power play, the Sharks had 3 power plays in this game. The first one, Barabanov was in position of where Eklund should have been. On the second power play, Eklund got that positioning back. But then on the third power play of the game, it was Barabanov once again where Eklund should have been. So kind of an awkward situation there. Eklund was then also moved off of Hertl's line and kind of put on a makeshift fourth line, but I guess you could call it third line near the end of the game with Weatherby and Barabanov. So kind of an awkward situation between Booner and Eklund, because I thought Eklund was definitely, besides the top line for the Sharks, of course, of Dahlin, Meier, and Couture, Eklund was definitely the 4th best player for the San Jose Sharks in this game. Set up a ton of great plays, a beautiful setup to set up a 2-on-1 for the Sharks, another beautiful setup earlier in the game to set up a breakaway for Tomas Hertl, and just generally made some fantastic moves. And this is definitely looking up for Eklund as we move on into the next few games, where, of course, as I mentioned in previous games, now at 5 games played on the season, he only gets 9 before the Sharks have to make the decision of whether or not to keep him on the team or send him back down and not burn that year of his entry-level contract. Moving on to the third line, as I said, this line did not really stay together for a very long time. Balcers, Bonino, and Nieto. It was actually a pretty bad line for the San Jose Sharks. This was a pretty rare bad game for Nick Bonino, I would say. Matt Nieto really didn't even get much ice time in this one because he just didn't do much. If you had told me Nieto did not play in this game, I would have believed you. And Rudolf Balcers, oddly, was kind of, I guess you could say, rewarded for not having a great game for himself either, as he was put onto the second line with Hertl and Labanc as the game went later on. So I thought that was very strange. But in the end, the lines actually ended up sort of shaping up to be not too bad. If you were to call the second line for the Sharks Hertl, Labanc, Balcers, and then the third line for the Sharks of Weatherby, Eklund, Barabanov, and a fourth line of Bonino, Cogliano, and Nieto, I actually wouldn't be too disappointed with that. I would say you probably want Bonino still as that third line center with Eklund and Barabanov to give them a bit more of a defensive stability on that line, and then just have Weatherby with Cogliano and Nieto. I think that would be a much better lineup. But with what Booner ended up settling in this game, while I don't think it made made sense for the game itself, I do think is actually decent lines moving into the future. So we'll see what Booner actually decides to draw up for the following game on Thursday. And then moving on to the fourth line, Cogliano, I thought showed off, some decent speed in this game. Still the usual pretty decent game that he had. Weatherby, I actually thought, continued his upswing that he had started in the previous game against the Boston Bruins by having another solid outing. And then as well, we have Barabanov, who I thought had some nice plays, had some not so nice plays. So I guess you could say kind of averaged out to be an okay game for Barabanov, likely enough to keep him in the lineup, as I said, with how the lineup the lines ended up shaping up as this game went on. Onto the defensive side of things, as I said earlier on in this video, it was not the best defensive game for many of these players. Brent Burns looked lost multiple times on multiple different defensive zone shifts. In particular, on the second goal from Philip Forsberg, Brent Burns was just completely out of position in this one, kind of similar to how he was so out of position on the first goal by the Boston Bruins in the previous game by Brad Marchand. So there's that. Karlsson had a lot of very risky passes back into his own defensive zone. I noticed in this game probably 3 or 4 times that he wasn't necessarily burned on these passes, but he definitely could have been if the Nashville Predators team was just slightly more aware, or slightly, I guess, getting a bit of a better bounce in that situation. So I'd like to see Karlsson take slightly less risky plays in that regard when you're passing back to your defenseman like Jacob Middleton in that situation, because I like the risky plays when Karlsson jumps up into the rush, but the ones where you're just kind of passing it between defensemen, it's kind of unnecessary, I guess you could say. And then when we move on to the goaltending, James Reimer got the start in this one. All in all, over a full 60 minutes, I thought this was a very solid performance from Reimer, and he didn't really have much of a chance on the Philip Forsberg goal. However, the real issue that I come up with Reimer in this game was, of course, this first goal here by Matt Duchene. The Sharks had given up a very early goal in the previous game against the Boston Bruins, and the Sharks wanted to come up to a better start in this one. And yes, them taking a penalty certainly did not help their case, but this was definitely a very weak goal let in by James Reimer. Sometimes there's a situation where the defenseman in a position like this is screening the goaltender, but it definitely didn't really look so much like that on this particular play. It just kind of looked like Reimer let this one in pretty clean to Matt Duchene, so I definitely would have loved Reimer to make the save. So even though he kind of brought it back there at the end and ended up having a very solid game for the Sharks as a whole, the big thing that the Sharks wanted to do when they bought out Martin Jones this offseason to try and get goaltending that wouldn't give up these types of bad goals in tough situations for the San Jose Sharks. And now it's 2 straight games where, Adin Hill gave up that second one against the Bruins that he definitely would have wanted back. And now it's James Reimer giving up one to the Nashville Predators early in this one that he's going to want back. So hopefully the Sharks goaltending can bounce back in that regard going into the next game, because that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Thursday, where they will take on the Montreal Canadiens for the second and final time already this season. Just in the first 7 games of the year, the Sharks are facing the Montreal Canadiens twice, and they've already beaten them once by their biggest margin, 5-0, and we'll see if they can do so again as they return home for the first time in a couple of weeks since they played against the Winnipeg Jets. Class dismissed.